morning, everyone. We are heading to our second conference, which is titled The Medieval Guises of Odin, Asian Impostor, Man, God, or Magician. This conference is going to be given by Professor Annette Lassen from the Árni Magnússon Institute in Iceland. Professor, we would like to thank you for accepting our invitation. We really appreciate you taking your time to be here with us today. So we are going to have the professor's conference, the professor's presentation, and after that, we can open for a few questions from the audience. Professor, please feel free to start your conference, and thank you once more.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I would love to have come in person, but this is of course much easier. So I've been kindly invited to give a talk on Odin, or a presentation of my book on the Old Norse god Odin. My book on Odin first appeared in Danish in 2011, and this year, or earlier this year, it appeared at Routledge in an English translation, which was undertaken by Margaret Cormack and Helen Leslie Jacobson. It's slightly revised, but not too much. Only a number of chapters have been revised. Throughout time, researchers have interpreted Odin in countless ways, which has in turn fueled the notion of Odin as a particularly complex god. The research history on Odin shows that the many different interpretations of Odin depend on the different subjects and methods of the scholars, which I've found called for a new approach. The synthetic depictions of Odin, in which statements from different texts have been collected and fused to form a coherent picture of the god without consideration of their medieval contexts, are another reason that Odin has been taken to be a particularly complex character. The research history, which my book on Odin includes a chapter on, demonstrates, to my mind, the need for applying a contextual and textual historical method in the analysis of Odin. In my research and in my book, I included references to all occurrences of Odin in the Old Norse Icelandic texts, including Saxo's Gesta Danorum, which to a great extent, by the way, is based upon Icelandic sources, the Eddic poems, Snodazetta, and Ynglinga Saga. I analyzed the high medieval reception and literary presentations of Odin rather than the religious character of the god. Because of these exhaustive references, the book can also be used as a kind of reference book to the Old Norse god. But what is implied by what I have termed a contextual method? I have studied the different guises of Odin on the basis of the various textual contexts and on their background in the literary and Christian intellectual milieu of the time. Contrary to existing studies, this method is non-reductive in that I have not aimed at providing a synthesis about Odin's original or pre-Christian nature on the basis of the differing textual uses of him in the Middle Ages. Instead, I argue that the perceived complexity of Odin, which is often highlighted in research, is first and foremost a function of the complex textual material spanning a wide variety of genres, each with its particular literary conventions, and of the reception of Odin in early modern and modern mythological studies. And I should also say that they span a long period of time as well, from the 12th century until the 16th century. What we know of Odin rests on a number of paradoxes, which is what originally fueled my curiosity. Place names indicate that he was a particularly important god in Denmark and southern Sweden in the Viking Age. But place names do not reveal much of a god's characteristics. According to the place names, Odin does not seem to have been an important god in Iceland, but the primary written sources about him were, however, written there. This disagreement shows, and this is of course well known, that the medieval written sources do not always, or in fact hardly ever, represent a full or indeed a true picture of the past. It is therefore absolutely mandatory, to my mind, that we choose our methods and methodology with utmost care when we are studying pagan gods or rituals which are described in texts from the medieval period. In the following, I will give a few examples of Odin's changing guises and show how Odin is described as an Asian impostor, man, god, devil, or magician. Medieval Icelanders knew with absolute certainty that Odin was not a god. On the other hand, they also knew that their pagan ancestors in the old days had falsely believed that he was a god. Saxo and Snorri, two major historians and major theoreticians of paganism, both agreed that the so-called pagan gods were really human beings with magic abilities. They were magicians. Due to their magical tricks, the naive pagans miscomprehended their nature and took them to be gods. In the first book of Gesta Danorum, Saxo teaches his readers about the nature of the pagan gods. He says that in the old days there existed three kinds of magicians. The first kind was that of the giants. Following them were those skilled in divination, who surpassed the giants in mental power. The second kind subdued the first and gained reputation for being divine. Both of these were skilled in the art of delusion and appearing to change their form or that of others. There was also a third kind springing from the union of the other two. This kind had neither the bodily size nor the skills in magic of their parents, but they still gained credit as gods with those deluded by their magic. The deceitful nature of these false gods is illustrated by the well-known frame of Gylfaginning in Snorri Sturluson's Edda. Here, the naive Swedish king visits the clever Asians, Haur, Jafnhaur, and Thriðjim, and the names means high, equally high, and third, who trick him with their magic into believing that they are themselves the gods about whom they have just been telling stories. Gylfi then goes back to the Swedes, where he passes on these stories and the idea that the Asians are gods, even though they are only magicians, successful human beings with magic abilities. Odin is an Asian impostor, or perhaps it is the other way around. Odin is an invention made by Asian impostors. The writer of Ynglinga Saga, probably Snorri Sturluson also, describes Odin as a human hero, as do many other Old Norse Icelandic texts. A hero whom the pagans misunderstood to be a god because of his great arts, some of which were pure witchcraft. In the chapter entitled Frá Íþróttum Óðins, about Odin's talents, the saga writer provides an entire catalogue of Odin's arts and abilities. And here's a quote. Odin could transform his shape. His body would lie as if dead or asleep, but then he would be in a shape of a fish or worm or bird or beast and be off in a short while to distant lands on his own or other people's business. With words alone, he could quench fire, still the ocean, and turn the wind to any quarter he pleased. Odin had a ship which was called Skidbladnir, in which he sailed over wide seas, and which he could roll up like a cloth. Odin carried with him Mimir's head, which told him all the news from other worlds. Sometimes he even woke up the dead from the earth or set himself under the hanged. He had 2 ravens to whom he had taught to speak, and they flew far and wide through the lands and brought him news. In all such things he was preeminently wise. Odin understood also the art in which the greatest power is lodged, and which he practiced himself, namely what is called magic, that is CEVE. By means of this, he could know beforehand the predestined fate of men, or their not yet completed lot, and also bring on the death, ill luck, or bad health of people, and take the strength or wit from one person and give it to another. Odin knew everything about buried treasures, where it was buried under the ground, and he knew the songs by which the earth, the cliffs, the stones, and mounds were opened to him. And he bound those who dwell in them by the power of his word, and went in and took what he pleased. From these arts he became very famous. His enemies dreaded him, his friends put their trust in him, and relied on his power and on himself. He taught the most of his arts to his sacrificial priests, and they came nearest to him in all wisdom and witch knowledge. And from that time, witchcraft spread far and wide and continued long. After this description of Odin's talents and feats, Ynglinga Saga says that people sacrificed to Odin and the 12 chieftains and called them their gods and believed in them for a long time. In addition, it is said that Odin sacrifices for the Swedes, which precludes him from being a god. After Odin's death, the Swedes' delusions become complete. They believe that Odin has gone to the old Asgard, where he will live eternally. Therefore, they begin to worship and believe in Odin anew, believing that he reveals himself to them before great battles. In the prologue to Snodazetta, the worship of the pagans is also described as a delusion, but here it is described as a natural knowledge of the Creator, a loss of knowledge of the Christian God, and not a misunderstanding of the potential and the identity of a mighty man, as it is in Ynglinga Saga. By transferring the story in the introduction of Ynglinga Saga to Sweden, and by stressing that it is the Swedes who worship Odin and believe in him as a god, Snorri underlines the delusionary nature of pagan worship. The paganism of the Swedes is a widely used topos in Old Norse Icelandic literature. They, or the Swedes, converted to Christianity later than Iceland and Norway, according to the historical knowledge of the Icelanders, and their worship of pagan gods is depicted as extreme in many texts. It is therefore hardly coincidental that the worship of Odin and the other gods is placed in Sweden, and that it is repeatedly noted that the Swedes believed that Odin, Njörð, and Freyr were gods. This is the picture on the side is from a manuscript called Melsters Edda, which is from the 18th century. Now the Swedes thought that Odin had come to the old Asgard, where he would live eternally. Often the Swedes believed that he appeared to them before large battles. The Swedes believed that Njörð controlled plenty and prosperity for man. In the days of Freyr, the peace of Frodi began, then there was plenty in every land. The Swedes gave Freyr the credit for that. This is from Ynglinga Saga. By emphasizing that it is the Swedes who hold this belief, the author of Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson, has perhaps given the description of the worship a particularly pagan flavor. It is also probably not coincidental that Gylfi, who you can see questioning Haur, Jafnhaur, and Friði in the picture, that Gylfi is a Swedish king. According to the description in Ynglinga Saga, it is in any case a religious development that occurred among the Swedes, not among Icelanders or Norwegians. According to Ynglinga Saga, Odin is a human magician and a shapeshifter. He's also a teacher of magic. As we have seen, Ynglinga Saga is not alone in describing Odin as a sorcerer. In Snodazetta, Odin, who here calls himself Bölverkur, which means evil doer, changes himself into a serpent in order to obtain the meat from Gunnlöth, while on his way back to Asgard, he changes his shape into an eagle. In the prologue of the legendary saga, Gönguhrólfs saga, the saga of Walking Hrólfr, and the courtly romance, Sigurðar saga Þökkla, the saga of silent Sigurd, in a passage where readers are advised against skepticism regarding fantastic things and that has happened in the past, we are also told about Odin's magic abilities. According to this prologue, Odin is a teacher of magic, much like he is in Ynglinga saga. And this is again a picture of Odin from Milster's Edda. The prologue in Gönguhrólfs saga and Sigurðar saga reads, "It is also the nature of many stupid people that they believe only what they see with their own eyes or what they hear with their own ears, so that they think remote from their own natures things like the counsels of wise men, great strength, or the magnificent feats of their predecessors. So also, and no less, arts and sorcery and great magic with which they would cast spells to bring some people death or eternal ill luck, and others the world's esteem, wealth, and honor. Sometimes they stirred up the chief elements, and sometimes calmed them, like Odin and those others who learned the magic arts and medical cures from him." So he's also a doctor. There are examples of certain bodies having been animated by the inspiration of an unclean spirit, such as Eyvindur Kinnriva, Tornchik, in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, or Einar Skarfur or Freyr, whom Gunnar Helmingur, half and half, killed in Sweden. When historians of Old Norse religion describe Odin, his magical arts traditionally form part of his characteristics. Odin's magic is, in other words, interpreted as an aspect of Nordic paganism. This interpretation ignores the fact that Odin's magical skills resemble, in many ways, those of magicians who had nothing to do with Nordic paganism, magicians who were famous throughout medieval learned Europe, such as Gerbert of Aurillac and the biblical Simon Magus. And I'm going to dwell a little on Gerbert of Aurillac. But before turning to him, we shall have a quick look at the underlying theory of magic within the church. In the 8th book of his highly influential etymologies, Isidore gives a thorough description of the magical arts. It ought perhaps here to be mentioned that we have evidence of the existence of Isidore's work in Iceland from early on. The writer of Veraldar saga knew Isidore, and we have parchment fragments of Veraldar saga from around 1200 already, but the saga itself is considered to be earlier. In lists of book possessions from 1396 and 1397 from Hólastaður and Viðeyjar Klaustur, we also have mention of Isidore's work. It mentions Isidorus Etymologiarum and Isidorus Etymologiarum non plenus, which is not complete. Isidore's work, along with other writings of the church fathers, provided medieval Icelanders with a theory of paganism, pagan gods, sibyls, and magicians, and explained the nature and characteristics of these. It is important to keep in mind that medieval Icelanders had no direct access to Nordic pagan tales or even archaeological finds from the pre-Christian period. We can see that when we read the sagas of Icelanders, that the writers describe buildings from their own period. They describe medieval buildings and not buildings from the Viking Age. And also when they describe weaponry or shields, they describe you can cut off the corner of a shield. But in the in the sagas, but in the Viking Age, you had round shields. So they describe weaponry from their own time. They knew the names of the pagan gods from skaldic verse and place names, but the stories about the gods, the false gods of the remote past, if such stories of great length had survived, were inevitably transformed over the more than 2 centuries of exclusive Christianity. Icelanders took Christianity seriously, we should remember that. Even the old names of the days were reformed to obliterate the memory of the false gods of the old, as we are told in Jon's saga Helga, and this is something that did not happen in the other Scandinavian countries. It is well known that stories, which are not preserved in writing, become highly unstable in substance. We can, for instance, observe the changeability of stories over time in the sagas of some legendary heroes, such as Jormunrekur and Ragnar Loðbrók. There's no way that we can deduce the historical facts about the death of Jormunrek around 350 from the detailed accounts about him in Völsunga saga. And yet, the historical events lie buried in the tale and behind the tale. And no one today would claim that the Ragnar, whom we encounter in the saga, is even slightly reminiscent of the historical 9th century Reginheri, who is nonetheless believed to form the historical base of the Ragnar character in the saga. For one thing, Ragnar in the saga never goes to Paris, and Paris is not even mentioned in the saga. I have discussed this at greater length in a recent article in Daniel Sæborg's book, Crossing Disciplinary Boundaries in Studies of the Viking Age, which disappeared in Repulse. The great compilation of Isidore contains a whole catalogue of the magic arts. Isidore claims that the first of the magicians were Zoroaster, whom Ninus, king of the Assyrians, killed in battle. Among the Assyrians, the magic arts are abundant. By a certain knowledge of things to come and of things below, and by invoking them, divinations were invented and auguries, and those things that are called oracles and necromancy. Isidore also mentions women skilled in magic arts, with a reference to Virgil's Aeneid. She promises with her spells to soothe whichever minds she wishes, but to bring hard cares to others, to make the water of rivers stand still, to turn the stars back, and to raise night ghosts. It's almost like Odin in the Prologue and in Ynglinga saga. Isidore mentions Mercury's necromancy. It is told that he recalled perished souls to the light, wielding a wand that he held, but condemned others to death. For with a magic murmur, you know how to summon faint shapes and cunningly to enchant sepulchral ashes. In the same way, the malicious arts know how to despoil others of life. There are, according to Isidore, magicians who are commonly called evildoers, maleficus, because of the magnitude of their crimes, much like bölverkur, which could be a translation, I would say. They agitate the elements, disturb the minds of people, and slay without any drinking of poison, using the violence of spells alone. Some evildoers summon demons, make use of blood and victims, and handle bodies of the dead. Necromancers are those by whose incantations the dead, brought back to life, seem to prophesy and to answer what is asked. According to Isidore, there is a number of possible ways to be able to predict the future: geomancy, hydromancy, aeromancy, and pyromancy. Those who accomplish their craft with words are called enchanters. Augurs are those who give attention to the flight and calls of birds. The Phrygians were the first to discover the auguries of birds, but Mercury is said to have first invented illusions. Finally, a certain kind of magi study the stars and the signs of the heavens and predict the character of men and the future. They are commonly called astrologers or mathematicus. According to Isidore, magic first arose in Babylonia with Zoroaster, which, by the way, coincides with the place where idolatry also was believed to have commenced as a consequence of the confusion of tongues after the building of the Tower of Babel. In the Middle Ages, the biblical myth of the Tower of Babel was used to explain the emergence of the different languages, and it was, furthermore, used as a theoretical background for explaining the origin of the different pagan religions. According to Genesis, mankind originally had one language and believed in the one true God. People may therefore have wondered how paganism originated, as the Discipulus of Elucidarius did. Elucidarius was a work written by Honorius Augustodendis, or he's believed to have been the writer, which was well known in Iceland and even translated into Old Norse Icelandic as early as the 12th century. According to the myth of the Tower of Babel, God stopped the people in Shinar when they began building a city with a tower reaching into heaven by confusing the language of the whole world, and scattering the people all over the earth. The splitting of the original language, which was Hebrew, into a multitude of languages, commonly believed to be 72, eventually formed a basis for the theory of the origin of the worship of the pagan gods. The loss of knowledge of the original language was considered to have paved the way for the disappearance of the original and true belief in the Christian God, which subsequently resulted in a variety of disbeliefs, which were indeed variants of the true religion. As it was formulated plainly, when 72 languages exist, so also 72 religions exist. This conception lies behind the prologue of Snodazetta, and also the information in Gylfaginning, where the multitude of alternative names for Odin is said to originate in the different languages of the world. Now back to Isidore. From Isidore's chapter on magicians, we immediately recognize a number of Odin's characteristics: divination and necromancy, the spells with which minds can be soothed or hard cares can be brought onto others, and night ghosts raised. In Isidorian terms, Odin can be said to be an enchanter. He is a magician who accomplishes his craft with words. But he is more than that. In relation to his embalming of Mimir's head, he can also be said to handle the bodies of the dead. Odin can perhaps also be said to be a kind of augur who gives attention to the flight and calls of birds, in that he uses birds to gain knowledge. In his choice of magical characteristics, the writer of Ynglinga Saga appears to have been acquainted with Isidore, and he may even have molded his description of Odin according to it. Given the spread of Isidore's work and its centrality for medieval encyclopedic knowledge, it would actually be remarkable if the saga writer had not known it. There are three elements in the description of Odin in Ynglinga Saga and Snodazetta which seem to go beyond Isidore's description of magicians. This is his possession of an oracular head, his ability to change shapes, and his art of localizing buried treasures. These elements are often considered important in the search for authentic pre-Christian paganism in learned medieval narratives on Odin. But how about Mimir's head? John Lindo has argued that Mimir's head may be inspired by shaman masks, some of which to a greater extent resemble human heads than faces. Odin's possession of Mimir's head may, according to Lindo, have been considered historically plausible due to the well-known existence and use of relics, that is, bodily parts of deceased saints, within the church. Mimir's head may, according to this view, have been considered a pagan counterpart to a Christian relic. But this explanation of the strange story of Mimir's head, although in many ways attractive, I think, overlooks even closer parallels in medieval legend and historiography, histories of magicians who create oracular metal heads or statues. It should be noted that Odin's possession of Mime's prophetic head is not a commonplace in Old Norse literature. We find the story in Ynglinga Saga, but neither in Snorri's Edda, Saxo's Gesta Danorum, nor the Sagas, and in the Eddic poems are there any allusions to the possession of the head. Or there are only allusions to the possession of the head in the Eddic poems, I would say. I wanted to say. This may indicate that the story was not prevalent. It may very well, in its surviving form, have been invented by the writer of Ynglinga Saga. The oldest preserved tale about mechanical and prophetic heads created by a magician concerns Gabard of Aurillac, and it is told by William of Malmesbury in his Gesta Regum Anglorum from the 12th century. Gabard of Aurillac was born 940 and died 1003. From 999 to 1003, he served as Pope under the name of Sylvester II. Gabard admired the wisdom of the Arabs, and he had a passion for mathematics and astronomy, and became a leading figure in 10th century science, astrology, and mathematics. He introduced Arabic numbers to the West, and he instructed students in mathematics and astral science in a more advanced way than had been done previously. He is said to have built an horologium, a clock, and a steam organ while he was in France. Earlier, Gabard had also been 3 years in Catalonia, where he spent time at the monastery of Santa Maria de Ripoll, which had an extensive library that included treatises indebted to Arabic tradition. Gabard achieved a reputation as a brilliant scholar and teacher that persisted for several decades after his death. He died only a few years into his papacy. He fell ill in May 1003 while celebrating Mass at the Church of the Holy Cross of Jerusalem in Rome, and died 9 days later. By the last decades of the 11th century, his reputation had become that of a magician. Probably due to his education in Spain and his prowess in the quadrivium, he became a target for accusations of necromancy and demonic arts. This is not surprising, considering that Isidore mentions astrology among the abilities of magicians. In Gesta Regum Anglorum, William of Malmesbury tells us that Gabard studied with a Saracen philosopher. There was one book, carefully guarded, into which the teacher had confided all of his arts, and which Gabard desired, and finally managed to steal after getting the teacher drunk in order to make him pass out. When the teacher woke up and discovered the theft, he pursued the pupil, but Gabard then called up the devil with incantations and now entered a pact with him for protection. William of Malmesbury also tells how Gabard carefully inspected the stars and constructed for himself the head of a statue that could speak. If he asked it a question, it answered truthfully in the affirmative or the negative, etiam or none. Gabard interrogates the head of his own future and asks the head, "Shall I die before singing Mass in Jerusalem?" And the head answers no. Gabard misunderstands this equivocal answer and thinks that he will keep himself from dying by not traveling to Jerusalem. Therefore, he stays in Rome, where he, according to William, dies when singing Mass at the Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem by the Lateran in Rome. Later works also tells of other magicians possessing oracular heads. The Roman poet Virgil gained a reputation as a magician in the Middle Ages, and according to Gautier de Metz in his Imago Mundi from 1245, Virgil created a prophetic head. Other famous students of mathematics and astrology, apart from Gerbert, were said to be in possession of such heads, that is Robert Grosseteste, Albertus Magnus, and Roger Bacon. So I will allow for a little digression here. Gerbert's head is an automaton, that is a mechanical device made in imitation of a human being. There survives one automaton from antiquity, that's the so-called Antikythera mechanism from 80 years before Christ, which was found in a shipwreck, along with texts from Alexandria with detailed designs on how to construct automata. These texts were not fully translated into Latin before late 15th century, but they formed in part a basis for the theory and practice of the making of automata in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. From the early Middle Ages, caliphs and emirs built mechanical heads, mechanical animals, clocks, and fountains. Such mechanical devices arrived in Europe as the results of military, commercial, and diplomatic encounters, and they became a source for imaginations, for instance, in romances, in Tristram's saga, which was translated in 1226. In a recent monograph on the subject, E.R. Truitt writes, and I quote, "Until the 14th century, most automata and the knowledge needed to create them were associated with places viewed as repositories of scientific knowledge and natural wonders, but also of or anti-Christian beliefs. This tension dramatically shaped the ways automata were portrayed in medieval European texts." According to Ynglinga Saga, Odin immigrated to the north from Asia, near Tanais, that is, from the eastern shores of the Black Sea. This area was pagan, it lay outside the borders of the Christian world, but according to the medieval worldview, it was, nonetheless, closer to the terrestrial paradise than Europe. As Truitt explains, these lands in the east, approaching paradise, were the loci of magical substances, magical skill, natural knowledge, aesthetic delight, and un-Christian morality. And to Latin Christians, these places were also the sites where automata could be found. Medieval literary texts beginning in the 12th century often contain automata in a foreign setting, at the courts of Byzantine or Muslim despots, or in the distant pagan classical past. In Saxo's Gesta Danorum, Odin comes from the same area. He has his residence in Byzantium. In order to worship Odin, the kings of the north make an Odin statue of gold, and when Frigg steals the gold from the statue, Odin has an alarm system made. Whenever the statue is touched, it speaks. It has been argued recently that Odin's speaking statue is inspired by Mimer's head. But this statue too is an automaton, a clever Byzantine device, where it is actually placed physically. Odin's talking statue and talking head have obvious resemblances. I have suggested in my book that Mimer's head is a magical device parallel to Gerbert's oracular head in William of Malmesbury and Odin's speaking statue in Gesta Danorum. In Ynglinga Saga, Odin is described as a religious leader, just as Gerbert was within the church. Gerbert had a reputation as a magician. Odin was a magician. What is more, both Gerbert and Ynglinga Saga's Odin are able to locate treasures that have been buried by pagans a long time ago. Gerbert gains his knowledge of hidden treasures by using necromancy. Odin is also able to make the dead speak. That is, he is a necromancer, and he can also make the earth open by using incantations. William of Malmesbury likewise tells the story of how Gerbert once makes the ground open in the search for an underground treasure. We know that 12th century Icelanders knew Anglo-Saxon chronicles in Latin, where Odin is mentioned repeatedly in genealogies. it is probable that the tale of Odin's possession of Mime's head in Ynglinga Saga has been inspired by the same or similar source as the fables about Gerbert in Gesta Regum Anglorum. In fact, William of Malmesbury comments that the stories about Gerbert are on everybody's lips. So we have seen how contemporary beliefs shape the description of Odin. He is described as a magician, a priest, a teacher of magic, who is miscomprehended as a god by the Swedes, despite the fact that he is just a human, a successful Asian immigrant who doesn't mind faking to be a god. But Odin is much more than that. In the different versions of the saga about Norway's first missionary king, Olaf Tryggvason, there is an abundance of tales about him. In Oddur Snorrason's Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar, from the latter part of the 12th century, we find a passage in which Odin seeks out Olaf Tryggvason as gestur or guest at Avaldsnes in Norway. The passage is later incorporated into Heimskringla and Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar in Mesta, the Great Olaf Saga. Oddur Snorrason presents Olaf Tryggvason as a precursor of Saint Olaf, as John the Baptist was the precursor of Christ. At the end of his saga, he terms Olaf Tryggvason the Apostle of the North, and during the saga, he provides theological elucidations of occurrences which involve pagan elements. So, the passage that I want to dwell on begins with the information that the devil has observed the increasing power of God and therefore has become envious. He therefore changes his appearance to that of a human being and visits the king while he is at feast at Avaldsnes around Christmas. And Christmas is a dangerous time, according to the sagas. The guest is described as an old, one-eyed man with a wide hood who is very talkative and able to tell many things. The guest is able to tell the king about kings of earlier times and their battles. At the encouragement of the king, the guest tells him about the eponymous king of the Cape of Avaldsnes, where they are situated. This former king, Ögvaldur, loved a cow so much that he always had it with him and drank its milk. In one of the two burial mounds on the Cape, the cow is buried, in the other, the king. When Olaf Tryggvason goes to bed that night, he summons the old guest, who sits with him and answers many of his questions. The longer the guest talks, the more the king desires to listen to his speech, Oddur tells us. So the king ends up staying awake for a long time during the night. Even when the bishop reminds the king to go to sleep, the king finds that he needs new answers for every question that the guest has answered. Late in the night, the king finally falls asleep, but soon wakes up and now immediately asks if the guest is awake. They search for the guest, who cannot be found. The king gets up and summons the cook, who says that an unknown man had come to him and commented that the meat that they were preparing was lean, and instead gave him 2 large fat pieces of meat, which the cook then prepared for the king. Now the king finally realizes that this is all deceits of the devil. He asks the kitchen staff who they consider the guest to have been, but they have no idea. The king concludes that the guest was the devil himself, who had taken the shape of Odin. The men throw the meat into the sea, and even though they search for the guest far and wide, he is never found. The next day, the pagan Eyvindur Kelda attempts to attack Olaf and his men while they are at mass, but he and his men are struck with blindness. By the end of the chapter, Oddur Snorrason concludes that the devil had attempted to make Olaf oversleep in order for him not to worship God. But the attempts of the enemy of all mankind to prevent the king from attending Mass only led to his own derision and disgrace, he writes. The moral of the story is that the more the devil reveals his foulness, the more he is beat down and disgraced. The devil, or his substitute Odin, can in effect only do what is permitted by the Christian God. But still, the stories by the devil Odin have been told, and in effect, they stay with the king as part of his knowledge. The shared characteristics of Gabod of Aurillac and Odin indicate that medieval Norse writers must have regarded Odin as a type on an equal footing with them. The dangerous arts are indeed also, perhaps not surprisingly, among the abilities of Antichrist, according to the aforementioned Elucidarius by Honorius Augustodunensis. The Magister here tells the Discipulus, Antichrist will be born in Babylon the Great. Magicians will nurture him in Chorazin, and he will rule over the whole world and subjugate all of humanity in 4 ways. First, the nobles with wealth, which he gives them in abundance because he has knowledge of all hidden treasures. Secondly, he will terrify the ignoble with great fear and frightful suffering because he is most cruel towards the friends of God. Thirdly, he deludes the learned with wisdom and eloquence because he knows all arts and is familiar with Holy Scripture. Fourthly, he seduces monks. He causes great miracles and many wonders. He causes fire to fall from heaven upon his enemies and the dead to wake up to reveal the truth to him. But Antichrist is not really able to wake up the dead, the Magister then reveals to his Discipulus. The dead only appear to be alive because demons, with the help of Antichrist, inhabit them and make the dead speak and move. Odin's magical arts and abilities in Ynglinga Saga and Snodazetta are apparently medieval and directly derived from a Christian or from the Christian context in which the Old Norse Icelandic texts about Odin was produced. The description of Odin as a magician is consistent with the overall euhemeristic view and representation of Odin in the Middle Ages. The euhemeristic description, the description of gods as human beings, were often viewed as stories which were classified as an invention or a fable, fabula. For instance, when Paulus Diaconus in his Historia Langobardorum tells the story of how Godan, that is Odin, was tricked by his wife Freya, that is Frigg, he presents the tale as a ridiculous fable, ridiculosa fabula. In the epilogue of Snodazetta, the users of the book are in like manner warned against taking the stories about pagan gods too seriously. And the picture on the side here is again high, just as equally high and third, and the Swedish king questioning them now from around 1300 in the Codex Upsaliensis of Snodazetta. But Christians should not believe in pagan gods or in the truth of these stories, except in the sense expressed at the beginning of this book, where it is told what happened when mankind lost its way from true religion. So if the stories about the gods were not considered historia, things which have happened, if these stories were no more important as such, then medieval writers must have been free to compile, invent, and fabricate new narratives about the gods, as long as what they wrote did not conflict with Christian doctrine. In the description of Odin as a magician, medieval writers constructed a new narrative based on the Latin texts they had available in their libraries, narratives that were fully compatible with what learned Christian theologians had to say on paganism or false belief. But did they have completely free hands when they wrote their stories of Odin? When one examines the textual reception of Odin from translated hagiography to Eddic poems, and I have, of course, only been able to mention a few of these in this presentation, it becomes clear that both differences and similarities exist among the depictions of this god in the different genres and texts. The pagan god does retain recognizable elements from genre to genre and from text to text. That is not to say that the different genres provided necessary guidelines for the ways authors and editors could let Odin appear in the narrative. They were, of course, not so inherently conscious about genres as authors of the genre distinctions in the Middle Ages as scholars are today, editors and scholars are today. But the writers or editors of Icelandic sagas or poetry must nonetheless have sensed the possibilities offered by the depictions of, for example, Viking kings, Icelandic heroes, or missionary kings. The writers must have known which possibilities or limitations were linked to the narrative's geographical and temporal setting. The use and depiction of Odin depends, among other things, on these factors. Odin thus never appears in Iceland, although he can appear to Icelandic heroes when they travel far from home. Even if the Christian and missionary theme allowed it, Odin does not appear to Icelandic saints, although he does appear to Norwegian missionary kings. That Odin does not appear in Iceland could, however, be due to factors other than the texts themselves. There are no place names derived from Odin in Iceland, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, so perhaps there were no place for him in stories that were set in this geographical space. In the same period, Icelandic saga writers and poets, Oddur Snorrason, Snorri Sturluson, and many others, both anonymous and known, referred to Odin in narratives that took place in locations other than Iceland. In line with the various forms of depiction of Odin in individual works, the mortality of Odin is emphasized in various ways. In Ynglinga Saga, as I've touched upon, Odin dies an old man, while in Snodazetta, he is killed in the violence of Ragnarök in a battle against the monster Fenrir. In Gesta Danorum, in which the pagan gods otherwise die off like flies, one after the other, nothing is said about Odin's end. Weakened, he disappears, almost fades away from the history of Denmark without comment immediately before the introduction of Christianity. Finally, in some poems, Völuspá in Högsborg and Hyndluljóð, Ragnarök and Odin's death are depicted as a natural abolition to paganism prior to the coming of Christ. The emphasis on Odin's character traits and abilities are, by and large, contingent on context. Saxo's history of Denmark has the glorification of the Danish kingdom's honorable past as its goal. In agreement with this, Saxo has Odin emerge as the special patron god of the Danes, although at the same time, the Gesta Danorum shows the Danes' journey from paganism to Christianity. In Ynglinga Saga, a text that is on the border between king sagas and legendary sagas, Odin to some extent appears as a chieftain who is reminiscent of certain figures in the legendary sagas. Still, he also has devilish traits, which agrees with his description as one who introduces pagan worship and ritual into Scandinavia. In Gylfaginning, Odin is described as a pagan misunderstanding of the Christian creator god, in agreement with the Prologue's presentation of the natural understanding of God. Gylfaginning is often characterized as a mythography, and it is only in Skáldskaparmál, the poetic diction, that the Edda is fully a handbook for poets. This also influences the description of Odin through the long very long and detailed story about Odin and the meat of poetry, he appears first and foremost as a god of poetry. In comparison to the prose texts, the Eddic poems stand as a group alone. The poems are among the texts that the authors of the Edda and Ynglinga Saga used in their antiquarian work. In these poems, there are no Christian interpretations of Odin as devil or demon, and the medieval use of the poems shows that they were probably understood as pagan. The poems, each on their side, depict Odin in different ways and emphasize different qualities of his character, as is the case in the other texts. In Völuspá and Baldursdraumar, Odin is depicted as a powerless god, but his lack of knowledge and his impotence are connected with the objectives of the poems to evoke a tragic event in the world of the gods. In Hávamál, Odin functions as an advisor, but the stories about Odin that are included in the poem show as a kind of exemplar that Odin does not at all follow his own good advice. On the contrary. In Vafthrudnismál and the riddle contest in Hervara Saga or Heiðreks, Odin is cunning itself, not to be trusted. While in Grimnismál, which revolves around the initiation of a king, he is presented as Valhall's mighty warlord. Finally, in Lokasenna, he is described as an unmanly god, and in Hárbarðsljóð, on the one hand, a deceitful liar, and on the other, a successful warlord and womanizer. It appears a banal reflection to say that the picture of Odin in these poems is decided by their specific purposes. Nevertheless, it is often forgotten in research about the Nordic gods that the NEVE terminology, which the Senna form in Lokasenna demands, for example, must be taken into account. My book on Odin in Saxo's work and in the Old Norse Icelandic literature shows, or I have intended to show with the book, that Odin was still a potent character in the Middle Ages. New stories were composed about him during that period, and these stories were meaningful for their times. With my study on Odin, I aimed to show that the individual textual descriptions of Odin in Saxo and in the Old Norse Icelandic Middle Ages were formed in agreement with the text's demands and objectives. In this way, Odin appears as a literary figure who is bent and shaped in medieval texts. Stories in living religions are, of course, also fluid, even despite various initiatives to create a canon of scripture. Stories are intrinsically changeable. How the use of gods and mythological narratives in the North have diverged, we can obviously never know. But our understanding of Odin necessarily depends on the Old Norse Icelandic texts from the Middle Ages, and therefore an understanding of the nature of these must be prior to any attempt to search for an authentic pre-Christian guise of Odin. Otherwise, we may confuse medieval elements in the description of Odin in the texts with fossils from pre-Christian religion. That said, Old Norse Icelandic literature, with its manifold, imaginative, and inventive approach to the pagan past, is definitely also worth studying on its own terms. And here, just to show you that the manifold descriptions of Odin just continues. Thank you.
Sorry, Victor, your microphone is off. You need to turn it off. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. That was an incredible lecture.
Thank you.
We have here some questions from the audience. We have 2 questions from Johnny Langer. Even though the pre-Christian nature of Odin isn't your main focus, what do you consider about queer theories on Odin? And the second question is, the researches about the statue of Odin in Lejre as an affirmation of political centralization in Denmark before the time of Harald Bluetooth.
Yes, thank you for these questions. Actually, when I set out to study Odin, my intention, I thought that by studying the complete corpus of written sources, that I would be able to argue that he had this feminine component to his character. But I just found out that something else. I think the queer theories of Odin, I think what Jens Peter Schjødt has argued with this feminine component of the wisdom that Odin achieves in different of the skaldic mead is convincing. He gets his knowledge from female creatures, the Völvur, and from the mead that has been in the possession of a giantess, and of course we are told that he changes. He dresses. He's a cross-dresser in Saxo's Gesta Danorum, but he cross-dresses in order to rape a woman to get revenge for Balder in that story. So I think the queer theories of add more up when we are discussing Loki, because he's so willing to cross-dress, which we actually don't see. I think the accusations of effeminacy are dependent on the demands of NEVE. But he's described as an immoral character to some extent, but not. I don't think that I think the theories are more convincing when it comes to Loki. About Odin in Lejre, I wouldn't really be able to say. I know that the archaeologists are discussing whether this is actually Odin. Some archaeologists claim that it's a female figure, but that of course could be used for people arguing that there's a female component to Odin's character. So I can't really I'm not really able to answer that last question.
Okay, thank you. And we have one last comment, also from Professor Johnny Langer. It's more of a curiosity. I noticed that you use the editions of Carl Hafen's Sagas. In 1830, he believed that the Vikings had come to Brazil because a friend of his, Petelund, lived here in Brazil and was a supporter of this theory. Just a curiosity.
So that's really interesting. I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. We have a question from Pablo Miranda about the night ghosts mentioned in Isidore's work. I always remember a passage in the Eridithia saga about the Froda Wonders, a series of strange things that precede the appearance of dead people, things that happened just after the death of a woman called Thorgunna. Thinking that the reception of Isidore's work in Iceland came from the education and literacy of the local clergy, is it possible to think the result of these ideas, which also end up transforming the figure of Odin locally, is an amalgamation of different cultures, both literate and oral? Or is there a total predominance of literate culture over oral culture?
I think, and this is of course something that is impossible to prove, but I think that of course people have been telling stories, and people have been telling stories about the past. We have several instances of that, and things that we thought were inventions, like the settlements in Lanso Meadows was considered an invention and unhistorical until this Norwegian couple found the place in 1961. So we know that they knew a lot of things, and we know that they knew the names of the gods, and they have known stories. They have known stories about their ancestors. They have known stories about ghosts and things that have happened, but they have learned in schools and in church how to understand, how to structure what they knew about the past. So I think we always see, or almost, of course not always, but I think that we should. I think that most often what we see is a mixture of the two. That we have something which is old and which has been preserved orally for many years, and it has been given a medieval shape, or it has been filtered through medieval learning. So I think it's a mixture of the two, which is true of the mythology, of the sagas, and about I think almost everything that they wrote about their own past. And I think also when you look at Odin, for one, because you have all these differing stories about him that do not add up, but there's still a kernel to his character, and that is somebody who shows up, who is unrecognizable, to test people or to gain something from them. So, but it's not much, but you have. I think that's probably genuine, because you see that in so many in so many different texts.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Kai Felipe. What were the intention and purposes of Snorri Sturluson's works in situating Norse mythology in historical times, centuries after Christianization?
Well, that was it was how would you say, an intellectual movement in the time to be interested, or this, you were, so to speak, allowed to be interested in your pagan past. So you see it in Saxo's work, where he includes lots of information about the pagan gods, not as much as in Snodazetta. Snorri, of course, does this to make poets be able to continue composing poetry in the old way, using the kenning system, which is based on the myths or the stories about the pagan gods. And if they are not known, they would not be able to do so. He says that explicitly in his work in the Edda. And about the immigration from Asia, that's how can you say, sort of plain or traditional historiography at the time, and goes back to Virgil's Aeneid.
Thank you. The next question is from Leandro Villar. Professor Lassen, can Odin's magical abilities and actions in the sagas be interpreted as the behavior of a trickster?
Well, yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so. But I think medieval Icelanders and readers would have read and understood the stories in accordance with what they had learned about magicians. But I think yes.
Okay. I have a question of my own. Do you reckon medieval sources allow us to argue in favor of shamanic traits in Odin?
No.
You
No, because I think the description of Odin as a shaman, well, he's a priest, and you can the description of him as a priest and a shaman god do not really add up. So I think the description of Odin and these you're thinking of this leaving the body, and the description of him in Ynglinga Saga and this CEVE stuff, that it belongs to the description of him as a priest, as a high priest, and doesn't belong to the description of him as a god.
Okay.
So I think that's something that has been added, and is a construction, or has been added to the description of him as a human figure with magical abilities and a priest, as is described in Ynglinga Saga.
Thank you. Everton Silva is asking, in the poem Lokasen, there are some verses in which Loki tells a story about Odin disguising himself as a woman. Would it be that the Vikings' narratives were filled with these kind of moral aspects?
Well, yes, that's a stereotypical or stereotypical content of these accusations that a man has been a woman, or he has acted like a woman. We find that in both sagas and in this, and in Lokasen, of course. So yeah, and that's of course, and that it's a symbolic accusation, which has no truth to it. It's the utterance of the words are supposed to or mark a man as somebody who is morally depraved to such an extent that he doesn't really belong within the borders of society.
Marcelo Student is asking, considering the theory of the gods being real humans in a far past, is there any proof or something that indicates the origin of Odin, like he came from Siberia or another Asian place?
Well, the Norwegian Heyerdahl, he set out to dig at an area at the Black Sea to prove the that Odin had immigrated from there, but he wasn't able to prove anything, and I can't methodologically. Of course, I'm not an archaeologist, but methodologically, I cannot see how you can prove immigrants from a place only to a certain place. Definitely, what he did to Hayadel was that he read the account of this widespread account of an origin around Troy as an actual historical event, which it isn't, because then all the nations would originate in Troy according to this. But what we can, of course, Odin is and he, how can you put it? He's a religious invention by people. He's a construction, an intellectual construction. But you can see, of course, that he belongs and probably was worshipped in the southern part in Germania and the southern part of Scandinavia and Denmark and the southern part of Sweden. But he's, of course, I mean, he's an invention by human beings.
Okay, I think the questions are all answered. We haven't got new ones. So people are thanking you for answering them, Professor.
Thank you for the questions.
And we too would like to thank you once more for accepting giving this conference here during our digital event. We hope this was a good experience for you as much as it was for us. It was a pleasure.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.